In this video, we're going to create our own custom exception. All right, so I have this skeleton where I'm just importing javax.swing, and I've got a main method here, but there's no code in here. So we're going to create our own custom exception. So I'm going to create a new Java file. I'm going to call it, we'll go ahead and call this Pokemon exception. Okay, so maybe this exception is thrown when you have invalid Pokemon. And we're going to just extends runtime exception. Okay, so runtime exception is an unchecked exception. So what that means is that we're going to create a subclass of this unchecked runtime exception. And that means that when we use it, we don't have to actually do try catches or check in order for our code to compile. Okay, so we can use this runtime exception anywhere in our code, and our code should compile just fine. If we had used a checked exception, which I'll go over in a different video, or maybe later this video, then we would have to do some things to make sure that our program will compile. So I will go ahead and now you'll notice that I have extended runtime exception, but I haven't added any other code to this. And if I compile it, well, after I save it, if I compile it, you'll see that it compiles just fine. Okay? Even though I haven't really added anything in here. Okay? So now if I go over to my main method here, I'm going to let's collect some input from the user. So we'll do jOptionPane.show input dialog, enter name. Okay, and what we'll say is all right, if the name that they type in is equal to Joe Pokemon, then we'll say that's an error, because maybe the Pokemon's name can't be Joe Pokemon. So we'll do throw new Pokemon exception. All right, and this Pokemon exception, again, is this new class that we just created. So we're going to prompt the user to type something in, and if they type in Joe Pokemon, it should throw this exception. Okay? All right. So that's basically all we're going to do for now. So let's go ahead and compile this. It compiles. And if we run it, we'll say Joe Pokemon. Okay, and you'll see that we get this error, exception in thread main Pokemon exception. Okay, it doesn't give us any kind of a message or anything like that. Okay, so there we go. We have completed our custom exception class. All right, well, that's not particularly interesting, so let's go ahead and make some modifications to our custom exception class. Let's make it so that we can actually pass in some sort of an error message. So in other words, I want to be able to pass in name can't be Joe Pokemon, like that. Okay, and so in order to do that, I'm going to have to modify my Pokemon exception. I'm going to have to add in a constructor that accepts a string argument. So I'm going to add in a public Pokemon exception, string s. And basically, because I don't really necessarily want to deal with this on my own, I'm just going to make a call to super. Okay? So what this is going to do is this is just going to call the constructor for runtime exception. So runtime exception is the super class. So super with S, it's going to call runtime exceptions constructor, which accepts a string. Okay? So now, if I compile Pokemon exception, all right, that compiles. And if I go over here and compile this, okay, that compiles. And so now the only difference is when I run this, again, if I type in Joe Pokemon, then you will see that now I get this additional detail. So it says exception in thread main Pokemon exception, name can't be Joe Pokemon. All right. So this behaves very similarly to my illegal argument exception, but now it's a custom exception, so I could use this anywhere that I wanted to. So if we think of like those examples from our homework where we were catching both an illegal argument exception and a number format exception, now we could potentially catch a third exception, a Pokemon exception. So this is a way to sort of separate out the different types of errors that could happen in the course of your program. Okay, so that was an example of an unchecked exception. Now, what would happen if instead of doing this, we created a checked exception? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a new class, and we'll call this one a, I don't know, color exception. And in this case, we're going to just extend exception. So we're not going to extend runtime exception. We're going to extend just exception, okay? And again, we're not going to put any code in here, all right? So if I compile this, all right, color exception compiles just fine, no problems. All right, now I'm going to go back over here to my implementation class, and I'm going to try and use this. So I'm going to say if s dot equals Joe color. Again, these are just kind of toy examples to demonstrate how you might create and use a custom exception class. Obviously, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a new color exception. Now, I have to just use an empty argument constructor because I have not bothered to put in any kind of constructor that accepts any arguments here. So I'll just do it like this. Now, the difference is that this exception class right here that I'm extending, this is a checked exception, okay? Whereas runtime exception over here is an unchecked exception, okay? So if I try and compile this file, you will notice that now I get this error, okay? And it says unreported exception, color exception must be caught. So remember, because this is now a checked exception, I have to deal with it in order to get my program to compile, okay? So one way that I could deal with it is I could say, put all of this in a try-catch block. Catch color exception E. Okay, and then this is where you print out some kind of a message. J option pane dot show message dialog. There was a problem. Okay, and I have to put in this try catch block just to get my program to compile. Now remember, before, when all of this was not here, when it was like that, okay, the program compiled just fine. And it compiled just fine because Pokemon exception was an unchecked runtime exception. Well, it's a subclass of that. All right. Whereas now with this new color exception, this class exception is a checked exception. So that means that in order for my program to even compile, I have to handle that exception appropriately. And so we've talked about multiple ways to do that. The easiest way is to put it in a try-catch block. The other way is I could have declared that this method main throws color exception. All right, so we'll go over that in a second. So now I should be able to compile this, and it compiles just fine. And if I were to go ahead and run this, and I were to enter in Joe color, okay, it catches the exception, prints out that there was a problem, and then the program finishes. Okay, so that is one example. Now, again, the other thing that I could have done is I could have, let's take out this whole try-catch block. Okay, now if I do that, again, I'm back to the situation where, oh, I guess I don't need this. All right, now I'm back to the situation where my program won't compile. Okay, because, oh, well, it won't compile because I've got some kind of a syntax error in here. It looks like I deleted an extra curly brace. Okay, but see, it's saying that you have to, again, I've thrown this color exception, but it has to be handled because it's a checked exception. So the other way, besides surrounding this in a try catch, is I could do this. I could say, all right, this method is going to just throws color exception, okay? And now my program will at least compile, okay? Now, obviously, when I run it, if I type in Joe color, okay, it's going to throw that color exception again, all right? Now, keep in mind, in color exception here, again, I have not added in any code at all, okay? It's going to just take the behavior of the superclass exception and do whatever that class does. If I want to make it accept a message, like I did over here, where you can actually pass in some kind of a string, then I would have to go ahead and do the same thing that I did in Pokemon exception and add in a constructor. So public color exception, string s, and we'll do the same thing that we did before. We'll just make a call to the superclass constructor. So this is just calling exceptions constructor, and it's passing in this s argument. Okay, so I should be able to compile color exception. That compiles just fine. And now I can go in here and I can put in some, Joe color is not a valid color or something like that. Okay, and if I compile and run this, then you will see if I type in Joe color, then you will see exception in thread, Joe color is not a valid color. Okay, so that's basically how you can create your own custom exceptions. We've created this Pokemon exception, which is an unchecked exception because it extends runtime exception. And we created this color exception, which is a checked exception because it extends exception rather than runtime exception. And we've pointed out different ways that we can deal with this checked exception, either by surrounding it with try-catch blocks or by adding this throws color exception line up here into the method header.